Good morning. It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the received wisdom seems to be that Humza Yousaf, the First Minister of Scotland, leader of the SNP, is to resign as Scotland's First Minister later today. I mean, listen, I am very much, what did Eric Cantona say? I'm a seagull, not a trawler today. It's very much the case that I'm just following the lead of Sky News, the BBC. You heard from Gina Davidson, our Scottish editor. I can't quite imagine that they've all got this wrong and that everything's going to go back to normal before close of play today. I hear we may be looking at an announcement at around 12 noon. Now, there are a couple of things that occurred to me early doors this morning. The first of which is how important it is for me not to sound like I'm reporting on the political situation in a foreign country. I can see why, more clearly than I ever would have done if I hadn't got this job, I hadn't done this job for the last 20 years. I can see why so many people in Scotland feel as if they are routinely treated from London like second-class citizens, not just in the context of politics itself and the sort of Westminster heavy-handedness, but also in the context of London-based media reporting. So I do be on your guard for that if I need a quick steer, because I'm fairly confident that we would be having or asking the question that I'm about to ask if the programme was being presented from Glasgow or Edinburgh. If this was a Scottish-based radio station, I think I would still be asking the question that I'm asking. This isn't, I was getting my self-defence in early, but I have found myself recently increasingly drawn to the question of what the hell has happened to the Tory party. So I'm not on the outside looking in, as it were, when it comes to questions of what on earth has happened to the SNP. It's a conversation coming from within the story, not without. But here we are. If I were to start in 2016, when, of course, Scotland voted to remain in the United Kingdom and in the European Union, and the decision to depart left, any sense that you were not masters and mistresses of your own destiny, almost impossible to refute. I thought, and so did many people contacting the programme, that the independence cause would receive an enormous fillip. That the SNP, as their raison d'etre being Scottish independence, essentially, would be a huge beneficiary of being dragged out, of Scotland being dragged out of the European Union against its will. And I wouldn't say that the opposite seems to have happened, but it's certainly the case, isn't it, that has not come to pass. I'm not, the one bit where I will plead Anglo-centricism or London-centricism is on the differences between English law and Scottish law. So charges have been brought against the former First Minister's husband, and that is about as far as I am prepared to go in the context of having any contribution to the conversation from that angle. But I interviewed Humza Yousaf about a month ago. Can we check when it was? Was it about 6 weeks ago? If that, it feels really recent. I'd say it was in the last 5 full disclosures. I sat down with him and he struck me very much. I spent an hour with him. It was a proper interview. And he struck me very much as a man on a mission. I came out of that, and this may well be a mark of my incompetence as an interviewer and a political analyst as much as anything else, but I came out of that interview believing that he believed that he was in with a very strong chance of leading an independent Scotland. I mean, it is the reason why you join the SNP. It's the reason why you want to become leader. I think Nicola Sturgeon believed for some time that she was. I think Alex Salmond believed that he might lead an independent Scotland. I think Nicola Sturgeon believed that she might lead an independent Scotland. And I came out of that interview with Humza Yousaf genuinely wondering whether or not I'd just spent an hour with a chap who would be or could be the first leader in a few hundred years of an independent Scotland. And now, in the space of a month and a half, we find ourselves contemplating his departure from the top job. So, what's happened? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Dougie points out that if you were broadcasting from Glasgow, James, you would have just said out with, not without. So little nuances like that notwithstanding, I want you to talk me through what has happened. How has Scottish politics gone in the space of a few weeks from relative calm to complete turmoil, complete chaos? 8 minutes after 10 is the time, and the phone lines are open. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So the first question, really, there's two confidence votes this week, one in him personally, the other in his government. I think that the Clever Money Now this morning says that is not going to happen. Neither of those votes are going to unfold because he is going to hit the high road before the ballots even open. He's written to Scotland's opposition parties, asking them to find common ground ahead of the votes. That doesn't seem to have gone well. And this is now me speculating from the position of observer. The epic miscalculation, I would say, on this electoral pact with the Greens seems to have taken him by surprise. That's the bit I can't quite get my head around. How could a supposedly astute, a historically astute political operator have got something so very badly wrong? Now, I know some of the backdrop. The Greens were making noises themselves about possibly calling time upon the coalition. And he essentially gave them their sandwiches wrapped in a roadmap before. He dumped them before they could dump him, if you want to bring it down to sort of teenage romance type analogies. But it appears to have precipitated the collapse of his entire government, which presumably means that he made a mistake in the way he dealt with the Greens before he even turned his attention to the single member of the Scottish Parliament from the Abbot party, Ash Regan, who I read this morning. I saw one description of her as having only joined the Abbot party because she hates Humza Yousaf so much. So, I mean, the descent from relative calm to relative chaos seems to me to be pretty remarkable. And I want you to talk me through exactly what has happened. And there won't be one answer to this question, will there? There'll be a bunch of answers to this question. But I want to hear yours. I want you to tell me, as someone who is more heavily invested in Scottish politics than I am, and that's inevitable, I think, because I don't live there and you do. As someone who is more heavily invested in Scottish politics than I am, I want you to tell me what has happened. And I mean, I don't know whether you want to take the Scotland referendum, the independence referendum as a starting point, whether you want to take the EU referendum, the Brexit referendum as a starting point, or whether you just want to take my full disclosure interview with Humza Yousaf as a starting point, where everything seemed to me to suggest that here was a fella in it for the long haul who genuinely believed that his political destiny was to lead an independent Scotland. And now he's not even going to be leading the SNP by close of play today, or he's certainly not going to be leading the Scottish government. All main Scottish parties have now said they'll vote against him. So the a confidence vote is pretty much a foregone conclusion. And I just want to try to work my way through what has happened and, crucially, of course, why. Let's start with Ian. Morning, James. I'm an SNP voter, and until we gain independence, I will vote for them. If it's ever achieved, I will then vote for the Greens. The SNP is the only party with any heft that has an indie Scot at the forefront of its manifesto, and it wins every time. I hope for another election before the general election so I can vote for them again. People keep forgetting about our proportional system up here and how it's meant to be run with minority governments and confidence deals. I mean, that's great. It doesn't answer any of my questions about what has happened in the last few weeks. What would you pick as your highlight? Would it be the tents on Nicola Sturgeon's lawn? Again, I'm not going any further down that particular avenue because I'm fairly confident on contempt and libel laws in England under English law, but I'm not confident of my understanding of them under Scottish law. And yet the milestones on the path to this morning's apparent chaos are legion, aren't they? So there it is. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The question is pretty straightforward. As somebody who is more heavily invested in Scottish politics than I am, what the hell has happened? What on earth is happening? Why has it happened? And I mean, I don't want to seem vain, but how wrong was I a month and a half ago when I sat there thinking that Humza Yousaf was in it for the long haul and possibly had a date with destiny. Tony's in Greenock to kick things off. I'm breaking the habit of a lifetime, taking a call before the first break, but it's an indication of this being one of those mornings where the callers will generally know a little bit more, or indeed a hell of a lot more, about the subject under discussion than I do. Tony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
thanks for taking the call. I'm an SNP voter, have been for a long time. Where I think the SNP are falling down is that in the basic things that they need to do as a government in Scotland, they're not doing them. You look at education, the educational standards are falling. You talk to any teacher in Scotland, the standard of education is falling. We were once at the top of all the league tables, but we're now falling down. There's a number of issues around which there's controversy, the ferries. I don't think it helped that when they got into bed with the Greens, that some of the policies that were put forward as green policies, likes of the recycling scheme, the gender recognition, for all the controversy that was, they were they may have been the best intentions, but they weren't executed very well. So it just gives you this impression that for all that they want independence, and a lot of people, I think, still want independence, and they are, as Ian said in your earlier message, they're the only party of any consequence who still carry that message at the forefront of what they want. So these people who want independence are drawn to the National Party.
You've got no choice. If you prioritise that under your personal politics, then you have no choice but to vote for them. If that's the single most important issue for you as a Scottish voter, then there's only one place. There's only one. Go on.
Sorry. I think it's a longer term play. You get independence, then you look at who the best party are to take things forward. Now, again, Ian kind of stole my thunder a wee bit there. I probably would not vote SNP if there was an independent Scotland, because I don't think the SNP are equipped to do it. This is the most.
I think this is the most overlooked element for an awful lot of English, Welsh, Northern, non-Scottish observers who think that they're quite clued up about politics. The idea that a vote for the SNP is a vote based on the idea that they will provide the best government of Scotland is simply not the case, is it?
No,
I mean, it will be for some people.
And it's proven to be that, to be honest.
And that is the problem that you highlight, actually. The problem you highlight is that they're not very good at governing. In your view.
They haven't been.
Yes.
They haven't got the best record. I don't think the talent pool is very deep,
I was impressed by Humza Yousaf. I really liked him as well.
He seems a very affable guy. He seems a very nice guy. I think circumstances have caught up with him in terms of it's 15, 16, 17 years that the SNP have been in charge.
Yeah.
And it's got the sort of last days of the Reich type thing, everything's just dying away.
Why? Why him? I mean, are you surprised at the speed with which it's all fallen apart since he became leader?
I think the whole thing with the Greens, they were basically holding up the SNP in Parliament.
Which makes the decision to walk away from them harder to understand, not easier.
I think it seems to have been a rash decision, but it all seems to have been prompted by this decision to
scrap the 2030 climate targets, and that probably made the Greens' position unsustainable. But I don't know whether there's a sort of, I don't want to say petulance, that's probably unkind, but whether the way in which so everybody probably accepted an inevitable schism, but the way in which Yousaf enacted the schism has managed to really upset the Greens much more than would have happened in the event of them making their own way out of the pact and I don't know, introducing a more peaceful schism, if that makes sense. 10:17 is the time. Phone lines are open. 03456060973. I don't know. I mean, already complaints about the reference, Tony's very passing reference to ferries. Suggesting that wasn't the case. I don't think that gender recognition lands with voters. Well, the polls tell us it doesn't land with voters in anything like the way that it lands with the media or with people heavily invested in those issues. So the question on what on earth has happened to Scottish politics remains largely unanswered, although inevitably, and I don't say this for any reason other than illumination, inevitably, I've got 3 people in my inbox now accusing Tony of not having been an SNP voter at all. So if you like me, observe Scottish politics rather than participate in Scottish politics, you would be a little bit surprised by the speed with which accusations of dishonesty and disingenuousness pop up whenever people hear something that perhaps they don't like the sound of. It's 10:18. It is 20 minutes after 10. How much of this is Humza Yousaf's fault? And how much of it is inheritance? How much of it is him simply being the man in the top job when the wheels came off? Because you look at the numbers and literally the vote would have been straight down the middle. If Ash Regan, who I read this morning only left the SNP because of her personal antipathy towards Humza Yousaf, if she had been persuaded to vote with the SNP in any confidence ballot, the split, the support would have led to a 64-64 tied vote. I mean, God, 52-48 being the infernal ratio, but a 64 score draw, 64 all. And the presiding officer would then be expected to vote to maintain the status quo. So, come on. I mean, it's almost certainly unsustainable, even if they'd managed to get 64-64 over the line. And he inherited that electoral pact. The decision to abandon the 2030 climate targets was his. That was an act of leadership from him, with the Greens accusing him of selling out future generations. Their vote on whether to remain in power with the SNP was pending. But it has, and there is also some unhappiness about NHS Scotland's decision to pause the prescription of puberty blockers following the Cass report. But I don't know how, well, I suppose it doesn't matter how that plays with the public, does it? If it plays big with Green MSPs, then it becomes a significant issue in the process that we're currently seeking to unravel. Peter's in Loch Lomond. Peter, what would you like to say?
The first thing I'd like to say, James, is I wish there was a James O'Brien in Scottish broadcasting, because the difference between the two tells a large story.
Well, I'm going to take that as a compliment, and I'm not going to ask too many questions in case it knocks some of the gloss off the compliment, Peter. So thank you.
No. It's 100% assured, guaranteed compliment. You asked at the beginning, James, how did we get to this situation?
Yes.
And you also mentioned personal antipathy a few seconds ago. If you go back to the last Holyrood election, which isn't very far long ago, Alex Salmond, who I think is the most vilified politician since Daniel O'Connell in British and Irish politics, was saying to the electorate, vote SNP 1 and Alba 2. And if that had happened, if he had come out, if Nicola Sturgeon had come out and agreed to that, or indeed supported it, they would have an absolute majority in Holyrood now, and they wouldn't be in this situation. The situation,
because the arithmetic would be very different, and there'd be a higher number of Alba MSPs.
The second vote is allocated proportionately across the parties, if you like, to produce extra seats. Yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, of course it does.
That's where it would be. I mean, I left the SNP because it stopped being a party of independence. And I always intended to vote Green after the day that Scotland became independent, but right. I couldn't do that because their party is more interested in identity politics than saving the planet. How did we get here? Personal antipathy, Sturgeon's antipathy against Alex Salmond, the man who made her in every way, is Shakespearean in its resonances. It really is.
You've got a lovely turn of phrase, Peter. No, really. I mean, it's a really lovely sort of historical and literary references. But I mean, I will read you the texts that come in now, inevitably, and this is why I find it such a hard path to navigate. So Tom's in capital letters saying, "I'm with Peter." And Carr is in touch to say, don't believe this Alba headbanger, he's talking nonsense. So do you see what I mean when I say that of all the subjects, maybe not all the subjects, but I do find this one tricky.
Do I sound like a headbanger, James?
Well, you do to him. That's all I can say. You don't currently to me, but that might be because I'm a sucker for your literary and Irish history references. But what you said about the breakdown in relations between Salmond and Sturgeon, I think that's a matter of historical fact. How does that lead to where we are today? How much of what is happening this morning with it widely believed that Humza Yousaf is going to walk the plank? How much of that is on him, and how much of it is a sort of inevitable upshot of what he inherited?
Well, it's fundamentally it's what he inherited. Although he was Sturgeon's candidate, so he knew what he was getting. Can I suggest something quite fundamental, and that'll make me a conspiracist. Ask
There's
yourself the
about.
question. Politics is conspiracies. Let's face it. Ask yourself the fundamental question: Cui bono? Who benefits from this situation? The British state benefits from it. The British state has never failed to infiltrate and undermine any threat in history to its economic interests, its territorial interests, or indeed its existential interests. So they're sitting gleefully rubbing their hands and thinking the agents have done well.
Well, that is the point where you do start sounding a bit mad. And thank you for giving me a heads up that you knew you were going to. So how would you account for that analysis? I mean, where would the fingerprints of the conspiracy you describe be found? Because
it's a reasonable question.
Because Humza Yousaf chose to jettison the Greens. The Greens were poised probably to remove themselves from the relationship anyway. The decision to scrap 2030 climate targets was his. I don't see where on any of these junctions the decision to turn in the direction that was turned would have been influenced by state actors south of the border.
Yeah, well, if you go back, the point is that how can I put this?
Well, possibly you can't. You can't provide me with any evidence because there isn't any. That's the point about it.
The SNP stopped being a party of independence, and then it decided to die on a number of mad hills.
Okay,
the biggest.
But how does that? Why does that point to British influence, British state influence?
Right to Sturgeon. She chose the path. I mean, one of the reasons
Nicola Sturgeon is an agent of the British state.
It wouldn't amaze me.
Right. I'm glad we got there. I pushed you, and we got there in the end. And that, I'm afraid, is probably the point at which we can both agree providing evidence to support that contention is impossible. 10:27 is the time. So you ceased to be an SNP supporter when Alex Salmond ceased to be an SNP member by the sounds of it. And again, I will read out the texts if they are helpful in the context of helping other people understand what a mad debate, or even a conversation, it's not even a debate, but already there are accusations of headbanging and bad faith. And the first caller was lying when he said that he was a supporter of independence. It is truly, and it's not funny because this is a matter of profound personal identity for people. It's the very roots of them. But for an outsider, it is very, very hard to get a bead on the light, as it were. Susan is in Abbey St. You say it, Susan.
Abbey St. Bathans.
That's what I would have said, actually. And then I thought it's going to be one of those ones where I say Beecham Place and I'm going to say it phonetically and it'll turn out to be pronounced completely differently. But it's not. So what's going on?
No, I just think that Humza Yousaf, any leader in Scotland, is damned before they even start, because a lot of people, especially in England, don't understand how a lot of things in Scotland work.
Well, that's very true.
So, a quick example.
I had no idea that Nicola Sturgeon was a secret agent of the British government until 5 seconds ago, for example.
I quite liked Peter until he went that far. But no, Sturgeon. Okay, so Sturgeon was arrested back when with her husband. It was like, she's been arrested.
Let's not go any further on that because I don't have. But that's just a matter of record. Yes.
What I wanted to say was, in Scotland, under Scots law, if you are in prison, if you're taken in by the police and they want to question you under caution, they must arrest you first. It means nothing. It's there to protect you, not the police. And people are arrested all the time and then let go. But it's purely a mechanism by which they can question you under caution.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it is also, of course, a matter of record that her husband has been charged in connection with the embezzlement of funds from the Scottish National Party. And so that's different from... But you're right to remind us that reporting in London of... The arrest of Nicola Sturgeon was possibly based upon a misapprehension that it was an equivalent legal situation to someone being arrested in England.
I mean, I slightly digress, but one of the biggest problems is that there is nowhere to go to get sacked So Humza Yousaf is the First Minister of Scotland. Holyrood has no fiscal powers. The only way they can raise their own fiscal situation is by tax. And they do, and we do pay a little bit more income tax. We get a hell of a lot more for it. But
none of this is helping me. None of this is helping me understand what's happening today.
Well, what's happened to Humza is it's the Tories, it's the Westminster Tories, the Scottish Tories. We have 7 up here. Not one of them was elected. Not one of them. They've all come on as list MPs, which, again, something England doesn't understand. Scotland has a partial PR system whereby...
But in terms of the self-inflicted nature of his current travails, how did it happen? What did he think was going to happen when he broke the pact with the Greens?
Well, okay, one of the main Scottish broadsheets, the Herald,
yes, 2
days before he broke the pact, Douglas Ross, may I wash my mouth out?
Okay.
Douglas Ross had a full-page article about how Humza Yousaf was going to be weak if he didn't sever the toxic link with the Greens.
Right.
2 days later, he severs the toxic link with the Greens, in inverted commas, and Douglas Ross is saying he's weak because
That's the leader of the Scottish Conservatives. But this doesn't answer my question. It just highlights your animosity towards Douglas Ross. And also, you're not suggesting... Go on.
I don't think Humza Yousaf had a chance because I don't think he himself has done anything. I think he's done the best he can. It's like trying to govern with a hand tied behind your back. Now, he may, his actual reasons for today, if indeed he does decide to resign, like all the
he's speaking at midday. It's been confirmed he's speaking at midday. It'll be a massive turn up for the books if he doesn't resign and just sort of delivers a speech about something else.
Wouldn't that be great?
Well,
but the other thing you have to remember, James, is our PR system is designed to specifically not return a majority government. And all this business about, how could he govern if it was 64-64? I mean, in the early days of the SNP, right, even when Nicola first started, before her heyday, it was a minority SNP government.
That's me told. I've got to crack on. I'm very late. It's 3 minutes late for the news. And also, you mentioned the Herald. A big fan of the Herald. They said this about my latest book. A compelling, thought-provoking and illuminating read. O'Brien doesn't hold any punches. It's a book that will make you gasp in shock, shake your head in bewilderment and wonder how any of this was allowed to take place in 21st century Britain. And the paperback is, of course, available now in all good bookshops. Time now for the very latest news headlines with Thomas Watts. It is 10:36. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. So, if I was an academic, I think of all the subjects of UK politics that I approach from an academic point of view, I think Scottish politics is far and away the best fit for that description. I try to approach it academically. You get haunted by comments that you make in this field, which is, live by the clip, die by the clip. That's the way it works, or live by the tweet, die by the tweet. But, I sometimes see representations of comments I've made on the question of Scottish independence that I don't even recognise. And I think, do you know what, maybe I did say that in passing 7 years ago, but sort of having hit over the head with it 7 years later when you didn't even really mean it at the time or think it through. So I once said something about I would feel a profound sense of loss in the case of Scotland achieving independence. But in the same breath, I have said that if I was Scottish, I think, especially over the last few years of watching Westminster so closely, if I were Scottish, if I had a vote in a referendum on Scottish independence, I think I would vote for it. So I've expressed both of those opinions in the same breath. And yet, in some corners of the internet, you'll find me being accused of being opposed to Scottish independence because I enjoy my holidays in North Berwick. And you just sort of go, you have to laugh at some point at the madness of social media commentary. Otherwise, Horatio, I shall go mad, to bring my own literary references into the conversation. So if I had an academic analysis of this, I would cautiously suggest to you that a lot of the trouble in Scottish politics at the moment. A lot of the trouble, confusion, febrility, if that's a word, is caused by that dichotomy at the heart of the SNP as both vehicle for or agent of independence, but also party of government. Now, as the agent of independence, as the vehicle for independence, they are unassailable. But as a party of government, I think it's fair to say they're deeply fallible. And that perhaps is a large part of why Humza Yousaf this morning finds himself in such warm water. How he managed to turn the temperature up himself is a question of personal political performance, and which I, as someone watching from London, I find that bit quite hard to unravel. But possibly everybody does, because it is hard to unravel. On we go. Inef's in Edinburgh. Inef, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First time caller.
Welcome.
Not the first time we've interacted. You did retweet one of my articles calling out the Conservatives, but that's perhaps for another day.
Go on.
So basically, I think I feel for Humza, because it was always going to be a difficult job taking the baton from Nicola Sturgeon and the brilliance of her that was essentially propping up the SNP. But he was the architect of his own downfall in the end. I think, he campaigned in a godlike fashion for progressive taxation, and then his flagship policy was the council tax freeze, which isn't really a progressive idea, is it? And then he also, he said he was the champion of democracy as an independent supporter.
Yes.
And then his his vehicle for independence was distinctly undemocratic. He was essentially saying, we'll negotiate as an independent country if we get most seats in Holyrood, but that could mean most people in the country didn't vote for him, and yet he would take us on anyway. So that was another thing.
Yeah.
And then also,
just let me pick you up on the tension between inherited a mess, which strong leaders can keep lids on chaos. I don't know if anyone's ever compared Nicola Sturgeon to Tito before, but after the fall of Tito, the idea of Yugoslavia surviving as an independent entity when it had, I think, 5 different countries, 6 different languages, 7 different. I mean, but Tito somehow, through force of will and personality, held it all together. Are you casting Nicola Sturgeon in a similar role? Are you saying she was the only one that could keep a lid on the chaos that is now unfolding?
I am, and the reason I say that is because I think the SNP were pretending to be a progressive, a party full of progressive lefties, when the reality is a lot of them weren't. Now, you've got to remember that when the SNP went to a leadership contest vote, most people didn't vote for Humza Yousaf as first choice.
No.
Most people voted for either Ash Regan or Kate Forbes, both of which had questionable views over same-sex marriage, for example. Kate Forbes did, Ash Regan didn't, and both of which didn't support trans rights, for example. So I think Nicola Sturgeon was propping up a party that, under the surface, were deeply divided.
And that speaks back to that dichotomy between being agent of independence, upon which all 3 of the names you've just said would be in lockstep with each other, and being a party of government, which is an odd concept when you've just described 3 people who wouldn't agree with each other about much else.
Yes, exactly. And he said that the Butte House's agreement was worth its weight in gold just a matter of days ago. And then 3 things he's done recently is change his climate targets. It was looking increasingly like he'd implement proposals of the caste review, which was a red line for the Greens because it adds another hurdle for trans people in an already difficult process for them. So his campaign messaging was all over the place, and I actually felt sorry for him because he was trying to keep everyone sweet, when the reality is that position was then untenable by the end.
I like that analysis. Almost certainly you'll be accused of either being a headbanger or a liar in my inbox in the next 45 seconds. But until that happens, Inef, I thank you for a relatively clear account of what appears, what is unfolding. And of course, if you're listening in Scotland, patting myself on the back for coming to a better understanding of the essential dichotomy between SNP as agent of independence and SNP as party of government. It'll sound like someone congratulating themselves for working out where bears go to the toilet or the religion of the Pope. But that's the point. That's the difficulty you have as a London-based journalist who's never lived in Scotland. trying to make sense of a political landscape that can often be, what would the word be? Confusing, I think, even if you are in it. So imagine what it's like if you're not. For example, we decide which bits of the programme to put out as clips, and we are currently toying with the idea of putting out the clip of me saying, to a caller, so Nicola Sturgeon is an agent of the British state, and the caller replying, it wouldn't amaze me. And I don't know what will happen to my replies or my inbox if we put that out, but I'm fairly confident it won't be pretty. Omar is in Glasgow. Omar, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning. I agree quite a bit with what the last caller said, although I think my positioning on it is probably different. And I feel that the Greens were very much the tail I was wagging the dog when it came to this coalition in power.
But that's the nature of coalitions, isn't it?
Absolutely, but then when...
And look at the power that the DUP had, which wasn't a formal coalition, but look at the power the DUP had over Theresa May when she needed their votes in Westminster. That's the weird imbalance of any parliament.
Yeah, but then when it got to the point where it was clear that this partnership or this coalition was untenable, and Humza Yousaf was the one to actually bring it to an end, they threw their toys out the pram because they weren't the ones who were able to actually pull the trigger. So it was, and it's thrown the country into turmoil. So it's immature of them to have done that. I also think, again, I agree completely that he was dealt a bit of a raw hand in terms of when he took over from Nicola Sturgeon, because he had all these things that were kind of hidden under the veneer of the party because Nicola Sturgeon ruled it with an iron fist. I think the best analogy probably is the one actually of Alex Ferguson retiring from Manchester United.
Yeah,
and then say like
that's probably a more helpful analogy than me bringing Tito into the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the idea that he wanted to prioritise the economy and actually alleviating, dull poverty and things, but he wasn't able to do that because of the constraints that the Greens were placing on him. I mean, I think it's a fairly honourable sword to die on, to be honest.
I like that analysis as well. Just out of interest, how much of what is happening now do you think he thought was on the cards when he landed the top job?
Well, I mean, this is where maybe I might be entering into the realms of conspiracy theory myself.
Oh, no, Omar, it was all going so well. Come on.
So, I don't think you can take a decision like pulling the trigger on a coalition government without knowing that you've got the full backing of your party. So I think he did it in good faith. And I think afterwards, when he's decided to go and speak to Alba, people in his party have said, if you do that, we're not going to vote for you. And basically, that's how he's ended up in the predicament that he's in. I'd be sad to see him go. And I think some of the names that have been thrown into the hat in terms of who could come after are quite worrying, shall we say?
Okay.
There isn't really any
because they speak so directly to that dichotomy that I keep coming back to, which I think is really helpful for non-Scottish people to understand, is that it's not a political party in the traditional sense when it comes to policy and government, because so much of it is defined by the unifying power of independence, the unifying power of the desire for independence, which is why Ash Regan ended up walking away. So is there any scenario in which he stays, in which he resigns and then runs again? Do you see what I mean? Or is it over for him now?
No, I think it's over for him. When it came to the leadership election, none of the big beasts of the party, if you like, actually stood for leadership, and that's because they probably knew that it was going to be a caretaker role to manage the decline of the party post Nicola Sturgeon. But I think
So what are we looking at? Kate Forbes, Stephen Flynn, John Swinney?
Well, I mean, John Swinney's probably the caretaker who'll be the safe pair of hands. I mean, some of the other names that have been thrown into the mix that are quite worrying are the likes of Jenny Gilruth, who's currently the Education Secretary.
Right.
And a couple of others who might not be actually ready for the role. But I think.
And a final question then: do you think Humza Yousaf was ready for the role?
I think it came too early for him.
Interesting. And I, I'm going on the basis of one meeting, but I you can learn a lot about a person in an hour. I thought that he would possibly be good for Scotland. They're perfectly entitled to disagree with that, but or at least sincerity and authenticity seem to be part of his armoury. Thank you, Omar. That was really helpful. I'm enjoying this. It's gone better than any I'm not pleading ignorance. Ellie's cross with me for tweeting that I'm doing a phone-in about Scottish politics and I will need some help. I need help every morning, Elaine. I'm not saying I need some help because I don't know anything. I'm saying I need some help because no one wants to listen to me pontificate about Scottish politics for an hour. That's all. So don't be mean. It's 10:48. 10:52 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where a lot of you, like me, enjoying this conversation. This is nice. Patrick says, I've learnt a lot about a subject that I'm curious about. And Jams in Liverpool says, really interesting chat this morning, James. Quite helpful too. When can we start talking about Welsh politics? Give me a chance, will you, man? Honestly. Let's get the Scottish situation done and dusted before we wade into Wales. 10:52 is the time. Humza Yousaf is to resign as Scotland's First Minister later today. It is almost certain. 12 noon. We'll take that news conference live. And the inevitability, perhaps, of the collapse that is being described is the first takeaway from today's conversation. The second, of course, runs a lot deeper, and it is the fundamental dichotomy at the heart of the SNP, whereby its status as agent for independence is separate from not just its competence in government, but also its policy offering. Best highlighted, perhaps, by unlikely, I suppose, when Rishi Sunak goes, if you had a sort of Penny Mordaunt versus Suella Braverman battle, then you'd have to say that it's remarkable to see two people ostensibly from the same party possessed of such violently different views. But for the SNP, it's normal to have people vying for the leadership who don't agree with each other about much, except independence, the overarching issue of independence. Mari is in Croft-Tammy.
Yes.
There you go.
Hello, James.
Hello, Mari. What would you like to say?
My goodness, what a wide-ranging conversation. By the way, I'm reading your book just now. It's super. I recommend it more.
Thank you very much.
And I also want to say thank you for bringing this up. You have brought up Scotland quite a lot in the last year, and you've been always open to what people say.
Thank you.
You don't have a closed mind, and I really appreciate that.
Well, it was my New Year's resolution, a couple of years ago to do better on Scottish politics. So I'll take your compliment as proof that it's working. Thank you, Mark.
You have. You do a fairer line on Scottish politics than BBC Scotland, who are just a propaganda unit.
Okay.
Our problem is, and I feel sorry that Humza's going because he didn't have a chance.
Right.
Since he's appointed, in Scotland we have one newspaper that's not owned by a Tory millionaire, usually a tax exile.
Which is the National.
Which is the National. All the rest are against us. Every policy,
and by us, you mean independence supporters?
Yes. Every policy that's come up by the Scottish Government in last year has by definition, BBC Scotland and these client journalists have said it is controversial. It's not controversial in England when they had a hate bill published a couple of years ago. The deposit scheme wasn't controversial in Wales. They were allowed to go ahead with it. Ours was stopped in its tracks. Nowhere in England or Wales do you have students' tuition fees paid. So we don't have thousands of pounds to be paid back afterwards. You have to pay for your prescriptions.
Yes.
It's currently nearly £10. We don't. It's actually cheaper just to give it to people than to start saying who's getting it, who's not getting it. We have the child payment, who a European report said made the biggest difference to poverty in Scotland than any of the other UK nations. We mitigate millions of pounds against the two-child tax. No other part of
I am conscious of this turning into a party political broadcast, but your central point is that the coverage of the positives is drowned out by the coverage of the alleged negatives.
That's right.
Yes.
That's right. And
how does that play into what we're talking about today? So that's what he was up against, but that's what Nicola Sturgeon was up against. Okay. That's what Alex Salmond was up against. So what's happened this week?
It's getting worse. Okay. When it was announced, it wasn't Humza who decided actually not to go with the targets. The committee in Scottish Government said, you're not going to make it. So you have to have a proper plan. The Greens agreed with it. The head of the Greens agreed with it. But what I think they did not sell it and talk about it. They just made the decision. Then Patrick Harvey discovered his whole party was up in arms against it. So he started saying, well, we might have to withdraw. So I think Humza Yousaf just decided, well, the Labour Party's not going to do it, so we will do it. But it was done badly.
But that's bad management by him.
I agree.
Yeah.
And it's not
Were you
like
surprised by that? Did you think he was going to do a better job when he got the nod, or not?
No, I'm not faulting on that. I think that has been a bad mistake. But I think the Greens are getting too big for their own boots.
Well, we're back to the tail wagging the dog, but that's the nature of electoral pacts, or not even electoral pacts, sorry. That's the nature of parliamentary coalitions, is that it doesn't matter how many of you there are. If you hold the balance of power, you have a hell of a lot of power. Who do you fancy next then, Mari?
I would like to see it open up to people in the Westminster Parliament. I think Stephen Flynn is absolutely brilliant.
I've done him on full disclosure as well, actually, which speaks to your earlier point about trying a bit harder to cover Scottish politics. I'm loath to say anything nice about Stephen Flynn in case I'm actually in the foothills of a new curse of O'Brien. Every time I say something nice about a Tory, they pop up the next week and do something disgusting. I think most recently it was probably James Cleverly who fulfilled that role. So I don't want the SNP to fall into similar territory, but I was very, very impressed. You can listen for yourself. I don't have to tell you what I thought. You can listen for yourself to the full disclosures with Humza Yousaf and with Stephen Flynn via Global Player, of course. Thank you, Maury. Last word on this to Craig, who is our first caller in England. He's in Pinner. Craig, what would you like to say?
I might be in England, but I'm Scottish. But I think quite simply it's arrogance, lack of accountability, and a sense that they were untouchable has led to this downfall by them. I'd probably say that the seeds of this were laid probably around about Brexit and then the 2019 general election, where they made so many gains. They just thought, we're never going to fall out of power. And then recently, over the past few years, they began to introduce legislation and laws and that the people don't want in Scotland. They've let things like education fall by the wayside, health fall by the wayside, housing, poverty.
But you heard Mari list an awful lot of things that people in England would give their eye teeth to have, what Scottish people have. So there's swings and roundabouts here.
And roundabouts.
In the context of the last week, could it have gone any differently, do you think, for Humza Yousaf?
I don't think so. I think the only thing he could have done was not uncommit to the 2030 target.
And then the Greens would have stayed on board.
Yes, and I think that's the arrogance that he's thought, well, I can pull out of this. I'll still have the Greens, and we'll still be in government. And he's thought, the Greens are always going to support me.
Because they'd rather be part of a government that isn't necessarily doing everything that they want than not be part of a government at all. So it's going to be. I'd ask you. I should have asked people this earlier, but I've asked the last two or three callers. Who would you want to take over next? Or do you speak to me as a unionist who doesn't care and who hopes that? As a unionist, and I would say I think. The SNP have so long went on about Westminster having an unelected Prime Minister that if they aren't to be hypocrites, they should dissolve the Scottish Parliament and have a Scottish election. Yeah. To that front, we're moving into Rishi Sunak territory, aren't we? We'll be the third.
Well, we are, but I think
third leader since an election.
I tell you who I think it was actually quite a shame that Kate Forbes didn't get the leadership, because I thought she had morals and she spoke her mind and she was willing to stand up and tell people what our morals are. It's just a shame that some people didn't like them, and she got outcast for that.
I think I can't really dispute your use of the word morals, but some people found her views deeply immoral. So probably best to go for religious doctrines in that context as opposed to morality, which is subjective, I guess. Craig, thank you, and thank you everybody. That was not uniquely, but a very helpfully illuminating hour. 11:01 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. There are two, front pages today that should really give us pause. The first is about the rounding up of foreigners. This is the Home Office seeking to detain UK asylum seekers across the country weeks earlier than expected in preparation for their deportation. And the other is about poorly people having the pittance that they currently survive on being taken away from them. I knit those together, and what do you get? 4 minutes after 11, Mel Stride, the Work and Pension Secretary, thinks that deep down, and those are his words, I'm quoting them, deep down you agree with him. You agree that millions of people on disability benefits should lose the payments that they currently receive, with particular reference from people suffering from depression and anxiety. Another quote, many people with the conditions should cease to receive sickness benefits, their ministers will argue. And instead, meaningful support will be offered, such as talking therapies and social care packages. There was even one report this morning about vouchers being given to people instead of money, so that the state would be able to control what your benefit payments were spent on, which is, I mean, listen, we're going to open the phone lines in a moment, and you can try to sell me the benefits of such a scheme. But that, to me, sounds almost a bit fascistic, to be honest with you. Quite a lot about what's going on at the moment sounds a little bit fascistic. In fact, I'd point you towards John Harris's article in his column in The Guardian today, which really stopped me in my tracks. Let me just read you this before we get... And he hasn't even touched on the disability issue. He's looking more at the Rwanda situation and some of the attendant immigration-related issues. But just listen to this. About 15 years ago, he writes, our politics was briefly unsettled by a surge in support for the neo-fascist British National Party. This would be, I think, around the time that Nick Griffin appeared on Question Time, wouldn't it? So I'll read that again, all right? About 15 years ago, our politics was briefly unsettled by a surge in support for the neo-fascist British National Party. At the general election of 2010, the BNP proposed, and these are in quotes, a halt to all further immigration, the deportation of all illegal immigrants, and the end of what it called the, quotes, asylum swindle. As well as pulling Britain out of the EU, it said it would repeal, quotes, far leftist social engineering projects, such as the Equality and Human Rights Commission, aimed at enforcing multiculturalism, end quotes. In the sense that if multiculturalism involves treating people equally, regardless of their skin colour, sexuality, gender, or where they come from, then yes, that is exactly what the Equality and Human Rights Commission does. And as John Harris points out today, the people who came up with this stuff were a mixture of inadequates and monsters. They were never going to get anywhere near power and influence. But long after they left the stage, it is sobering to see how much of what they spewed out has now made its way into everyday politics. And I would go a little further and say that the people coming up with this stuff are still a mixture of inadequates and monsters. But they're now in the driving seat. They now have their hands firmly on the steering wheel, firmly in the reins of power. It's not a little bit fascistic, James. It is fascistic. That's only a proposal at the moment. The idea that disabled people would receive vouchers instead of actual money is very much in the proposal stage. But my goodness me, it's a fairly chilling thought, isn't it? And it's all part of this crackdown on, I think, a largely mythical sick note culture. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Could it be that the massive uptick in people claiming sickness benefits is due to a massive uptick in sickness? And given the pandemic and its aftermath, the physical and mental ramifications of the pandemic and the lockdowns, it seems unsurprising to me that we are a nation struggling with our health on a scale that we haven't done so before. The proposed changes will reportedly target those with what the government terms mild mental health conditions that ought not to prevent Britons from working. And it may include receipts being required to claim money back from the state. The Telegraph reported this yesterday, while vouchers or treatment may be given instead of monthly cash payments. In other words, they're kind of making it up as they go along in the hope that the rhetorical impact of the phrase or the idea of a a crackdown on Britain's sick note culture. So it doesn't even get reported as alleged or supposed. It gets reported, even in newspapers that should know better, it gets reported as a fact. I mean, to be fair to The Independent, they put it in quotes, which is, I guess, the same as saying it's alleged. But Sunak vows to end sick note culture, as he says, number of economically inactive young people is a tragedy. This was last month. I beg your pardon, this was last week. And that was the claim that people who haven't taken a job after 12 months, if they're physically fit, would lose their benefits. Even against the backdrop of becoming a country where we're now rounding up asylum seekers as a precursor to deporting them. On the subject of newspapers, there was an extraordinarily disingenuous piece in the Mail on Sunday yesterday, claiming that the European People's Party in Brussels was adopting the same sort of policy as the British government has done with Rwanda. I mean, the brass neck it takes to write those words suggests to me that either they don't understand the issue or they don't care. Because what the European People's Party has done is look at the idea or endorse the idea of third country, safe countries of settlement. What the Rwanda proposal does is deport people to an unsafe country and use legislation to change the meaning of the word unsafe to safe. So for the Mail on Sunday yesterday to claim that the European People's Party endorsement of a policy that would deport asylum seekers to a safe country is somehow the same as a policy that sees us deporting asylum seekers to an unsafe country, that is fascistic. That is a new low, I think, in British media. I mean, it is a bit like saying that, well, it's not a bit like saying anything. It is literally claiming that deporting people to a safe country is the same as deporting people to an unsafe country. I spoke to the Archbishop of Canterbury about this on another full disclosure. It's been on quite a roll lately, full disclosure, hasn't it? I should probably mention it more. I'm too busy plugging my book. But I had a really fascinating conversation. It was published on Good Friday, appropriately enough, with the Archbishop of Canterbury about this. And he, of course, is opposed to the deportation of human beings to an unsafe country, albeit that he accepts the limits of his role and indeed the limits of democracy. But to pretend that deporting people to an unsafe country is the same as deporting people to a safe country is, even by the standards of what we've been covering and chronicling together over the last few years, that's got to count as a really sick new low that I can't quite believe I have to explain. 12 minutes after 11 is the time. So even against the backdrop of that kind of politics, waking up today to see depressed and anxious face losing their benefit on the front page of the Times, built upon the presumption that this is what Mel Strider's telling us, you deep down agree that these people don't deserve their benefits. You deep down believe that millions of people are either faking or exaggerating depression and anxiety in order to secure a relative pittance in welfare payments, because that is preferable to going to work. And it is, I suppose, possible, albeit looks to me to be highly unlikely, but this depiction of a country crippled by a sick note culture is one of the oddest political flexes I've seen in a very long time. We talked about them running out of enemies. We talked a lot about it. The refugees fulfill a role, but immigration in general has rocketed by so much since Brexit that they can't really focus on legal immigration in the way that they did before Brexit. So you get a free pass on that if you've come here from overseas on a student, although the student visas are coming under attack today as well. But we said they were running out of targets. The woke stuff hasn't really worked. Attack on woke didn't really land, despite the best efforts of every right-wing blowhard and newspaper to turn it into the new political correctness. It hasn't really landed because the examples are so pitiful. Someone dancing at the Notting Hill Carnival is the reason why murders aren't being solved, or somebody wearing a helmet that has been, a police officer wearing a helmet painted in the colours of the pride flag is the reason why no one comes around your house when you get burgled. I mean, the presumption that the public are stupid is very politically powerful for right-wing politicians, but even they have a limit. The public aren't that. They might be stupid enough to vote for Brexit because they've been lied to so completely, but they're not stupid enough to believe that the police aren't solving murders after a decade of Tory cuts because they're too busy dancing at the Notting Hill Carnival. But they'll still try and sell you that. Junior doctors didn't quite work, did it? Attacks on teachers haven't quite landed in the way that they have done previously. Even partly thanks perhaps to the leadership of Mick Lynch. Even attacks on railway workers seeking better terms and conditions and higher pay haven't quite created the traditional target culture, I would call it, as opposed to sick note culture. So the Tories are betting the house on mental health. They're betting the house on the British public having a negative view of people presenting or claiming to have mental health problems, and I'm a little bit gobsmacked this morning by that juxtaposition of headline. Front page of The Guardian, we're going to start rounding up foreigners. Front page of The Times, we're going to start penalising people with depression. We're going to start penalising people with poor mental health. So, how do we know? I mean, I've done a couple of phone-ins on this lately, and it's really not easy to get signed off sick. And if you are signed off sick and you are statutory sick pay, you are not really in receipt of a significant sum of money. Some really poorly people can perhaps, through a variety of benefits and exemptions, can thankfully keep their heads above water. But the idea that this, I've done it before, haven't I, that this safety net is actually a trampoline in which it's joyful to bounce about without the requirements or responsibilities of work, seems to me to be so far removed from reality that I can't quite believe it's becoming a central platform of policy for the UK government. Who are we going to go after? Because it's not really about saving money. It's about creating the idea that there is a problem we will fix. So that's what it is. Here's a massive problem. Here are some people who are robbing you, right? Refugees, they're robbing you. Doctors are robbing you as a taxpayer. Teachers are robbing you as a taxpayer. Railway workers are robbing you as a railway user, as a passenger. They're robbing you. These immigrants are robbing you. Schrodinger's immigrant who's coming over here not only to steal your job, but also to sign on and do no work at the same time and send all the money back to wherever they've come. So these people are robbing you. It's like Trump, isn't it? So they're always trying to find someone for you to hate as a substitute for hating yourself or hating the people that have put you in the position that you're in. And they're going for people with depression and anxiety. I think I'm just going to ask you what you think about that, because Mel Stride thinks that deep down you agree. Maybe you do. Give me a call and tell me why. 0345 6060 973. And for now, you don't need a voucher to ring me. It is 20 minutes after 11. There are currently 360,000 people claiming personal independence payments for anxiety and depression. The figure has doubled in the last 5 years. I don't have in front of me the number of people who are working while claiming PIP payments, but I do have in front of me the amount of money that you get. And every 4 weeks, if you're on the sort of standard living only payment, you're getting 290 quid every 4 weeks on top of, if you've got universal credit or unemployment benefits. So I don't know where they're getting the idea from that this is actual policy as opposed to rhetorical and performative cruelty. I want to be wrong, but what do you think the waiting list is at the moment on the NHS for mental health issues? Just have a guess. Have a guess. How many people do you think are currently waiting to access mental health services on the NHS? And some of these people will have been waiting for months, if not years. Have a guess. The figure is pretty much 2 million. You're not going to get much change out of 2 million. 1.9 million people currently waiting to access NHS mental health services. 360,000 people currently claiming PIP for anxiety and depression. Mel Stride's suggestion is that instead of money, they will get therapy or some form of social care package. So just do those sums for me, right? Mel, there's 1.9 million people waiting for, let's just use the word loosely and say therapy. There's 1.9 million people waiting for therapy. There's 360,000 people claiming a personal independence payment for anxiety and or depression. And you're saying you're going to take their money away and give them therapy instead. But there's already 1.9 million people waiting. Well, you tell me. Julie's in Tewkesbury. Julie, what would you like to say?
Oh, good morning, James. Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted to say that the issue that I have is downgrading anxiety and depression. Anxiety and depression is absolutely the most hideous condition you can have. It's totally debilitating. I went through it because of a number of different traumas coming together. And I mean, to the point where I couldn't even go out to get something. I was living on my own. I had these crisis team people come round. They opened the fridge and said, what do you mean you haven't got any food? You've got frozen peas in there. Shut it, and left, and told my neighbours not to enable me. I tried desperately to get help, and I couldn't. And it was basically caused a combination of not actually taking care of carers, because I was taking care of my mom at the time.
Right.
And through lockdown, it became increasingly difficult. Lots of other things happened to basically...
I think this is crucial, Julie. The idea that if you just say, oh, it's doubled in 5 years, then we all go, oh, they must be swinging the lead. But if you actually remember what has happened in those 5 years, the idea that there's been an exponential increase in people suffering from these conditions seems to me to be perfectly plausible.
Absolutely. And I mean, to be a carer and be with somebody who's 94, who's got dementia, you're not seeing anybody during lockdown, and also, it's very difficult to get any sort of mental stimulation in that way when in social interaction.
But sorry to keep interrupting you, but there's an awful lot of people queuing up to talk, but I want to pin down, if I can, whether or not there might be, let us forget who is bringing this in. Let's forget that it's the party of austerity, that it's the party of deportation, that it's the party of Brexit and various other nation-damaging ideas. Is it possible that you would benefit more from treatment and or therapy than from a cheque every month?
To be honest with you, no, because the treatment and the therapy, it's not out there, and it's not fit for purpose most of the time.
But if I know this is hypotheticals upon hypotheticals, but I mean, if I were Mel Stride, God help us all, I would say, well, it's not out there now. That's why I'm bringing it in. So, I mean, it does exist, the treatments that I watched.
But this is a government that's made incredible cutbacks.
That's why I said, being the devil's advocate, Julie, that's why I said let's forget about who's bringing it in. Is it possible that there is a case to be made for a more tailored or bespoke approach to conditions like anxiety and depression?
So are they going to put this money into a silo that's going to develop those particular talking therapies? And is that what their proposal is? I mean,
you make an excellent point. How are they going to save money by doing this, given that, therapy is already prohibitively expensive for many, many people, and the government are somehow going to provide it while saving money? Yeah, you're right. You find many, many wrinkles. I'm sorry for your situation. We have tried and I think succeeded up to a point in the past in explaining what anxiety and depression can do to a person, how debilitating they can be, and how much of the response, and I think we can all be guilty of this sometimes, where you think that, I don't think you need to have been to a Spartan public school like mine, although it's certainly drilled into you in those environments on an epic scale. Come on, you can get through this. You can, resilience. It is often called, and these things exist. So I think somewhere inside we all think if someone is presenting with depression or anxiety, then we can sort of jolly them out of it, and yet it's the equivalent in many ways to telling someone with a broken leg that if they just put their mind to it, they could actually go for a marathon. They could go for a long run. You just see that. It was so helpful to me when someone did that to me and just said, just imagine it's physical health. Would you really tell someone with a broken leg that they should be doing pole vaulting and that all they need to do is just have a bit more of a positive mental attitude or show some resilience, go and run a marathon with a broken leg? Actually, there was someone on the news the other night who did run a marathon with he broke his ankle or something like that shortly before the end. But I digress slightly. 11:27 is the time. Thank you, Julie. Lewis is in Abbot. Lewis, what would you like to say?
I'm all for the changes myself.
Go on.
I think I'm as someone who receives PIP.
Yes.
And as someone who has PTSD, as well as a lifelong condition. In regards to movement and stuff like that,
yeah,
I think that we do need to look at it because I do think that
So which of yours benefits would we be taking away?
Well, it depends really, because like the PTSD is something I have to manage, and I've had to manage it for many years, and I've had many years of counselling. I've had years where I've not had to have counselling, so. Yeah. But I do think that, and I hope I don't upset people saying this, but I think there's too many lazy people who do not want to put themselves in the right place.
But how do we know you're not one of them?
Well, because I work, James.
Well, so do huge numbers of people on PIP.
Yeah, no, but there's huge numbers who don't, and I think.
Yeah, but we can take yours away as well.
Well, that's fine.
Because people working, they won't be the shirkers; they'll be the scroungers. You see,
I'm talking about the scroungers, and
but how do I know you're not one?
Well, because I work, James.
Yes, but scrounging just means you get more money on top of your wages through your PIP
James,
payment.
you're not helping me. You're not helping me have this debate now, are you? By just
I'm showing you what the rhetoric. I'm showing you what the rhetoric sounds like when you're on the receiving end of it, rather than.
Well, I've been on the receiving end of it for most of my life. For someone who suffered with PTSD, lost 10 years of his life, someone who has been homeless at times. Someone who has done work
exactly.
in the mental health
so your need is real and acute. How do we identify the people whose need is not real and acute?
Well, I suppose by making sure you pull them up when they're driving around in cars that are given to them on the sofa when they're actually using it to go to work in and stuff like that.
Hang on, they're not working. They're not what you said they weren't working.
Oh well. You might say they're not working, but they're doing a bit of
said they were. Right. How do we find them?
Well, by doing means testing and proper means testing. I mean, I personally
But if it's cash in hand, it's not going to come up on means testing.
Listen, I do agree.
I am listening. I think I'm listening a bit too closely, probably.
Well, no. I have listened this morning to what he had to say, and the fact that the means testing isn't. I don't think it's fit for purpose, and I think this is why some people are getting stuff that they shouldn't be getting.
Right.
Because
and how do we know you're not one of them?
How do we know? Well, do you want me to post my means test to you then, so you can read it? And do you want me to come on the show so you can physically see me? Would you like to know what I do for a living and how much money I earn?
You are on the show. I'm just wondering how the system will work in order to distinguish between you and someone who's not telling the truth about their condition.
I have these problems. I live with them.
Yes, and everyone you're talking about says that they do too. So how do we tell the difference?
Yeah, but I'm honest enough to come on here and say.
But they all say they're honest.
Of course they will.
All the scroungers and shirkers say that they're honest.
Of course they will.
So how do we know who's telling the truth?
Because we need proper means testing, don't we? And this is what they're looking at bringing in, and I'm all for it.
But means testing looks at what your income is, not what your illness is.
No, it doesn't. Not necessarily.
I don't think you know what means, mate.
Oh, look, I've just done a test, okay?
Yeah.
And no, James. I mean, do you claim PIP?
No.
Have you ever gone through the procedure of having to claim for it?
No.
Well, I have.
I
And
know.
I've had to do it for right. So,
But you don't think the system works.
I suppose, James,
You can't go from saying, Lewis,
James, in having to do this.
Yes, exactly, and it works for you. It's effectively worked for you.
That's because
So why are you opposed to it?
Do you think I really want to be on PIP?
No, I don't think you're listening to my question. You told me the system needed to be reformed, but now you're telling me that because you've been through it, you're the one that can say that it works.
No, I'm saying it. No, I said it needs changing. It needs looking at.
But not for you. Not for you.
Oh, actually, it does, because I don't actually think that I get what I possibly should be allowed to get due to my other parts of my
so you should be getting more.
Yeah, but
other people should be getting less.
Maybe, yeah.
And that is essentially what the policy is designed to achieve.
So
yes, in your mind, you should be getting more, and other people who fit into the categories that you've described as having free cars or lying about their illnesses and working cash in hand, they should be getting less. So I want you to get more. Or I certainly want you to keep what you're getting. What I don't understand is how we look after people like you without also looking after some people who may not be being completely honest. And if you can tell me what the test would look like, what Mel Stride's test would look like, then I'll bite your arm off. But we first have to work out how 1.9 million people waiting to access mental health services are going to be helped by adding another 360,000 to the queue. It's 11:33. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. 11:36 is the time. I've done a double take at some of this polling that YouGov have issued, and upon which you have to presume some of this sick note culture rhetoric is built. If you ask people what they think everyone should be able to afford, so that would include people who are too poorly to work or people who can't find work, or, of course, people who are in this category of lead swinging and scrounging and shirking, which we are supposed to believe is endemic. Only 3/4 of people polled by YouGov, 3/4 of the population, believe that people on benefits should be able to afford utilities. So that's electricity, gas and water. 76%. It's the highest thing that people should be able to afford, 76% of the population. So how many votes are there in the 24% of the population who don't believe that everybody should be able to afford electricity, gas and water? And that's even people on out-of-work benefits should be able to afford this, so 76%. If you add minimum wage to that, the figure becomes quite a bit higher. It goes up to 93. So you've only got 7% of the population who believe that people on minimum wage shouldn't be able to afford utilities, electricity, gas and water. 6% of the population think that only people on the average salary or above should be able to afford utilities, electricity, gas and water. Craig's in Clacton. As a man who just got PIP for the first time this year, James, I can tell you it's not means tested, and I had to fight tooth and nail for 2 years to get it. I had to provide over a year's worth of medical records from the hospital and specialists, and at no point did the GP just help me get it by just signing me off. But look, if someone on it, like Lewis, can believe that it is rife with fraud or lots of people who don't deserve it are getting it, even as he goes through the process of getting it, then these figures, these numbers, and perhaps even this policy begins to make a little bit more sense. Oh, I know someone who's got a free car. It's very, very like immigration. I took a call on LBC once from a woman who was adamant that immigrants were being given shops to run. I slightly before conspiracy theories took over Facebook and the like, but I found the root of it. Someone sent me the Facebook page where it had come from, a claim that they were being given businesses to run. And so convinced of it that she would ring the radio station to make the point. And I think the same thing happens with disability benefits as well. You show me someone who's taking the mickey, and then you need to persuade me that it's worth running the risk of punishing someone who isn't taking the mickey in order to make sure that we catch the person that is. It's just horrible. It sounds horrible. Ross is in St Ives. Ross, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. How are you?
Very well, mate. What's on your mind?
Yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying I disagree with the strongest sense possible of your previous caller. I work full-time and I also claim PIP.
Well, you know what? You know what's just popped into my head now?
Yeah.
Oh, he doesn't mean you. So as if the parallels with immigration, we haven't got enough parallels with immigration. Oh, I don't mean you. It's not you that should hate. It doesn't mean himself. It's not my personal independence payments that should be taken away. It's all the other people, the ones I keep reading about in the Daily Mail. Oh, dear. Anyway, on you go.
Yeah, so for context, I have both a degenerative disease, which is why I'm claiming PIP, but I also suffer with mental health. So I have autism and I have OCD as a result of that. And you might be aware that claiming PIP is very wired more towards physical disabilities as it stands. So when you go for a PIP assessment, there's two categories. There's daily living and mobility. Most of the questions to do with daily living are still related to physical attributes in some way or physical tasks in some way. So how quickly you can do a task, can you do a task competently and stuff like that.
So OCD kicks in there, doesn't it? Because if your OCD is bad, then it could take you, if you could do it at all, it could take you hours to do something that might otherwise take minutes.
Oh, of course. I presented, similar to the person who texted in, the guy in Clapham. I presented the evidence medically because with these things you're allowed to present a number of range of documentation statements from friends and stuff like that. It's recommended to give doctor's notes or medical information where possible because it strengthens you. They pick it apart anyway, to be honest with you. And despite providing a fairly large amount of evidence for my physical health and my mental health, I only really got awarded based on the physical health, and in the write-up it actually said his OCD must not be that bad because he still goes to work, or to the effect of that. And I was like, that's a great joke. I like that.
That's like Catch-22, isn't it? Is you can't be mentally ill because you want to come home from the war.
It's just depressing though, because being blunt with you, I'm not a fan of the Conservatives in any way, shape, or form, but. On paper, I'm doing exactly what they would be asking of someone in my position. We're trying to keep going to work. And to be honest with you, PIP's one of the things that keeps me in work. It keeps my mobility aids working. It helps with adaptation to the health. There's so many costs with having a disability in some format, whether that be mental or physical, that healthy people just don't appreciate. There's all sorts of things I could list. And if you know, you know. It's just, I don't know. I think what it is if I'm correct, the local elections are on Thursday. If I'm correct, if I've got my calendar right, I think a lot of it just throwing smoke before that to try and. I don't like the word dead cat, but you know what I mean? It just feels
a rhetorical device rather than a meaningful policy proposal. And of course, never mind the local elections, with the general election on the horizon, the enactment of a lot of stuff that is being announced now is going to be at least questionable. But it's the numbers, though, isn't it? So 360,000 people claiming PIP for anxiety and depression. What you've just reminded us of is that some of them will also be claiming it for physical conditions as well. So that already breaks that number down. Then you've got the number of people who are working. So that breaks it down still further. The Times doesn't bother doing this. It doesn't bother saying of those 360,000, some will be claiming for mobility and physical disability and physical conditions as well. Some will be in work, and then some will be in work and claiming for physical as well as mental conditions like you. And then they just want people to believe that there's 360,000 lead swingers out there.
The trick's in the name, James. It's personal independent payment. It's to do with the person, not the condition. So people obviously have complex health needs. Sometimes there's overlapping issues. So the payment generally is to offset the costs of a disability. And obviously the schemes you can go through, like Motability, to get cars and stuff and adaptations. There's already those kind of voucher systems in place. Yes. I don't really understand. There's no detail on what the proposed.
Don't understand who it's aimed at.
No, but to be honest with you, and this may be a rhetorical question, James, is considering a lot of the DWP's assessment capabilities is outsourced to companies like Capita anyway, is there really going to be the labour there to check through millions of disabled people's receipts?
I mean, that's question one. And question two is there really going to be the labour there to provide the talking cures and the therapy that is going to be put in place instead of the payment? So the more you talk about it, the more that it falls apart in your hands. But we are living in a political era where you're not supposed to think about what you're being sold. You're not supposed to look in the box.
No.
You're just supposed to buy the everything from austerity to Brexit to Boris Johnson to getting Brexit done. You're supposed to just don't think about it. Just believe me when I tell you, not only that there's a huge problem caused by other people, but I don't mean you, but I am also the person to fix the problem. You've reminded me, actually, Ross, of something that I saw on Friday. I went to the cinema to see Civil War, which I thought was a great film. But that's by the by, because just before it came on, there was an amazing advert for a charity called Frontline 19. They are a mental health and emotional well-being organisation specifically supporting the NHS front lines. I don't remember seeing an advert that hit me quite as hard as that new campaign that they have got out in cinemas. They support around 9,000 people every single week. And these are people working on the NHS front lines. And some of the statistics contained within that advert haunt me, actually, with 1 in 4 workers having considered suicide, talking about the prevalence of mental health issues within the NHS workforce. I'll retweet it now, actually, from my friend Miss Anne Harriman's account. And it's incredibly relevant to the conversation that we're having today. You know, people on the NHS front lines having to turn to charities to support as the government threatens to take financial support away from people who currently receive it and presumably need it. It's 11:46. It is 10 minutes to 12. I mean, it is scattergun, isn't it? Or we might bring in vouchers. Why would you bring in vouchers? Because these people can't be trusted with the money that they're getting from the state. Well, why? What, all of them? Yeah, they're spending it all on flat screen televisions, which they take home in their free cars. A friend of mine worked for Motability, and the metaphorical hoops through which you need to jump to get help from Motability is, you might argue, good. I'm glad that it's really hard. I'm glad that it's a difficult process. And I might not even disagree with you as long as it's fair. But, you knew because I told you it was going to happen. But I bet you didn't believe me at the time. I said, just wait and see. It will be the new immigrant. It's Pastor Martin Niemöller, isn't it? All day long. All day long. First they came for the trades unionists. I did not do anything because I was not a trades unionist. Then they came for the homosexuals, and I didn't do anything because I was not a homosexual. Then they came for the Jews, and I didn't do anything because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was nobody left to speak up for me. So the way that immigrants were demonised now applies almost entirely to people on disability benefits. And the way it works, at the very heart of the cruelty, is the idea that because you might be able to find some people who are in that category and displaying bad faith, so possibly someone from another country who commits a crime, or someone from another country who does elect to lead a life of laziness, and you use that to tarnish and malign and denigrate an entire population of people. And it's exactly what's happening here. And why are they doing it? You tell me. Samuel's in Northwich. Samuel, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello. Samuel.
So I work full time, and I am in receipt of PIP, like your last caller.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not the person who the government are pointing the finger at.
You say that. They could still save a few quid by taking your PIP away, couldn't they?
Oh, they could, but they don't understand the half of it, bless them.
Well, no.
They don't. So what I would say is I've helped people, dozens of people, in fact, to fill out PIP forms. So your previous caller was talking about the way that the forms are structured. I've helped people fill these forms out, only vocationally, because I've witnessed these people at support groups.
Yeah.
And they either don't know, this is the thing, these people don't know, many of them, that they can actually receive PIP.
Right.
Many of them have no idea, and other ones who are struggling with the process. So how dare I have empathy, James? How dare I have care for someone struggling in life, that they can actually get support?
There's two thoughts that occur to me listening to you. The first is that I think waiting lists for mental health treatment are close to triple what they were in 2010. So instead of fixing that, the plan is to take benefits away from people with depression and anxiety and somehow possibly even add them to those waiting lists. But the second thing is that these conditions in particular are going to be very susceptible to this rhetoric. I mean, it is if you have anxiety or depression, hearing conversations like the one Mel Stride has been having this morning is going to be triggering, isn't it? It's going to be traumatizing.
It is, and the word triggering has been unfortunately demonised.
Yeah, not on this show. So,
I know.
But I take your point.
I'm thankful for that, James. What I would say, I agree with you completely on that, but what I would say is that they're trying to, the way I see it is, give them an inch and they will take a mile completely. And the way I see it is, anxiety and depression are like the Wolves and West Brom of mental health, okay?
Yeah.
There's so much people going there, and that's their field. It's the most popular thing, if you know what I mean. But it's so many people have it nowadays. And the thing is, I've been in groups where people just are worried that things such as the benefits and their lifestyle, it just will be stopped next week, you see. Yeah. But what they're saying, you mentioned the point about things were better, but it was different in 2010, right?
Yes, of course.
And that's completely true. I mean,
the waiting list was shorter and access was easier. Things weren't perfect.
Well, I ask you this, James. There is currently, in my area, certainly in other areas that I'm aware of, there is a 2.5-year waiting list for people with ADHD anxiety for therapy. Now, if you've got 2.5 years to wait for that, and people don't have these, tell me, where are the government going to try and help these people with these vouchers, these imaginary vouchers that Mel Stride's talking about?
That's a proposal, but that it hasn't made its way onto the news agenda by accident. And Mel Stride addresses directly ADHD and talks about questioning whether an open question as to whether people with conditions such as ADHD or learning disabilities should also be paid disability benefits, given, and I quote, they come in all sorts of different forms of scales of severity, which is, I mean, it's an odd phrase at the best of times. But as you say, if there's a 2.5-year waiting list and treatment's going to mean that you can work or that you can work more, then that's 2.5 years where you are not able to. And now you're hearing that for the duration of that 2.5 years, you may not get the support, the relatively paltry support to which you are entitled. Samuel, thank you. This is from Nick, suffered from anxiety and depression due to burnout working for the NHS, which brings us back to that Frontline 19 advertising campaign that I found so powerful on Friday. You don't know how bad it is, James, until you've had it yourself. I still need medication to keep well after 10 years and keep in work. Forcing money worries onto sufferers will make their conditions worse. It's another ill-advised and callous policy by the Tories. And sometimes, Nick, in Newton Abbot, like you, I wonder whether the callousness is the point. Liam's in Bolton. We'll have to be brief, Liam, because I've got this Humza Yousaf press conference on the horizon. But what would you like to say?
Well, I find it interesting that you talk about Mel Stride's comments on ADHD. As someone who has ADHD myself, I find that the Conservative Party come in all different shapes and sizes and forms of inhumanity these days, to be honest. So, to be honest, Mel Stride might sit somewhere on that spectrum, but I can totally understand why he struggles, because I know that I do with mine. I think the fact is that there's so much to say on this topic, but as someone who has suffered a great deal with depression and that's been affected by my ADHD, and like the last caller said, I wasn't even aware that I was able to receive PIP, and I haven't received PIP funding. I worked whilst receiving talking therapies and being on antidepressants, which inherently made my ADHD worse in many ways.
Quite a common experience, that, isn't it? Yeah. Given in good faith, but completely deleterious effect on that condition. Exactly.
And the fact was that there were days, and there are still days, where my anxiety can be absolutely debilitating, and you work through it. Yeah. I think the fact is to sit here and make this point about, well, we can't, like you say, we can't trust people with this money, so we're going to give them vouchers instead. Like one of your other callers mentioned about, and we have to try and make sure the scroungers can't get that money.
Yeah.
it's not ideal.
Well, that was Lewis, who is himself in receipt of these payments as a consequence of both post-traumatic stress disorder and a debilitating physical condition. So that's one caller does not a summer make. But if you can persuade someone who is in that situation that loads of other people in the same situation are liars or scroungers, then how easy is it going to be to persuade people who thankfully don't have any of the issues under discussion? Liam, I warned you that we were short of time. The Humza Yousaf news conference is due to start shortly. It will be, I think we can safely say, it will be a very large turn up for the books if he doesn't use it to resign as Scotland's First Minister, which is a historic moment. So we will be taking that live. But the plan at the moment is to go to the news with Thomas at the usual time, and then I will be reserving the right to interrupt Thomas Watts as he brings you the news headlines in the event of Humza Yousaf assuming the position behind the lectern in, I nearly said in Scotland, but in what I presume is Holyrood or a government building. And we cross live now to the Humza Yousaf news conference, the Scottish First Minister making a statement.
I made that decision as leader of the SNP as I believed ending the Butte House Agreement was the right one for the party I lead. And I still do believe that to be the case. But most importantly, I believe it was the right decision for the country. My hope was to continue working with the Greens in a less formal arrangement as the SNP moved into a new phase of minority government. Unfortunately, in ending the Butte House Agreement in the manner that I did, I clearly underestimated the level of hurt and upset that caused Green colleagues. For a minority government to be able to govern effectively and efficiently, trust when working with the opposition is clearly fundamental. And while a route through this week's motion of no confidence was absolutely possible, I am not willing to trade my values and principles or do deals with whomever simply for retaining power. Therefore, after spending the weekend reflecting on what is best for my party, for the government and for the country I lead, I've concluded that repairing our relationship across the political divide can only be done with someone else at the helm. I have therefore informed the SNP's National Secretary of my intention to stand down as party leader and ask that she commences a leadership contest for my replacement as soon as possible. In order to ensure a smooth and orderly transition, it is my intention to continue as First Minister until my successor has been elected, particularly as the Parliament will be debating some incredibly important legislation in the coming days and the coming weeks. I cannot tell you what an honour it is being the First Minister of the country I love, the country I'm raising my family in, and the only country I will ever call home. As a young boy born and raised in Scotland, I could never have dreamt that one day I would have the privilege of leading my country. People who looked like me were not in positions of political influence, let alone leading governments, when I was younger. But we now live in a UK that has a British Hindu Prime Minister, a Muslim Mayor of London, a Black Welsh First Minister, and for a little while longer, a Scots Asian First Minister of this country. So for those who decry that multiculturalism has failed across the UK, I would suggest that the evidence is quite to the contrary, and that is something we should all celebrate. I've had the honour of serving in government for almost 12 years in a variety of roles. Whatever position I held during my time in politics, I've always been guided by my values. As First Minister, I'm incredibly proud to have a fair tax system, the most progressive in the UK, where those who earn the most contribute the most. And it will always be my core belief that in a country as rich as ours, wealth must be far more evenly distributed. I have no doubt at all that whoever takes over from me will continue the Scottish Government's drive to reduce child poverty. I'm proud that through our actions, an estimated 100,000 children are expected to be lifted out of poverty this year. I also hope that as a country, we can be really proud of the strides that we have made to tackle inequality, prejudice and discrimination. But let's also acknowledge that far too often in our country, hatred continues to rear its ugly head. In a world where every issue seems to descend into a toxic culture war, it is often the most marginalised in our society who bear the brunt. As politicians of all political parties, we're privileged to have a platform. Each and every one of us must resist the temptation of populism at the expense of minorities, particularly in a general election year. I've often said that as a minority myself, my rights don't exist in a vacuum. They're only protected because the rights of everyone are protected. And from the backbenches of the Scottish Parliament, I will continue to champion the voices and the rights of those, the rights and the voices of those who are not often heard, be that at home or indeed overseas, such as those suffering and continue to suffer the most horrific humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza as the world watches on. Let me say to my SNP family, I will always be with you. I will always campaign alongside you. We have had setbacks in our movement, but we have overcome them, and we will do so again. Independence feels frustratingly close, and believe me, no one feels that frustration more than the leader of the SNP. But the last few miles of the marathon are always the hardest, and we have run this race as a team, and I now will prepare to pass the baton to a successor who I'm absolutely certain will lead us over the finish line. And I will tell you today what I will say to that successor. First Ministers get to meet countless inspirational people in communities across Scotland working to make life better for those around them. First Ministers get to see firsthand many of the exciting businesses and industries that will power Scotland's future. And whenever First Ministers set foot beyond Scotland's shores, no matter where they go, in Europe or across the world, they encounter friends and admirers of our nation. If only every person in Scotland could be afforded the opportunity of being First Minister for just one day. On the very next day, it's my belief that they would vote for independence with both their head and their heart. To my fellow MSPs of all political persuasions, next week is a crucial milestone. We mark 25 years of devolution. We have an electoral system that is designed for no political party to have an overall majority. Devolution's founding fathers and mothers, rightly in their wisdom, believe that no one loses out by politicians sharing wisdom, sharing counsel, sharing ideas. But the converse is also true. That is why I would make an appeal to colleagues from across the political spectrum. The while government, of course, must act in good faith, so must their opposition, and be prepared to collaborate with us, not just oppose for opposition's sake. The only people who suffer as a result of such an impasse are the very public that we seek to serve. Politics and politicians, not unreasonably, I'm afraid, have often been maligned. However, I truly believe that when we get it right, and often we do, we are a force for good that can transform people's lives for the better. So to my colleagues in opposition, regardless of political party, I genuinely do wish you well. I bear no ill will and certainly bear no grudge against anyone. Politics can be a brutal business. It takes its toll on your physical and mental health. Your family suffer alongside you. I am in absolute debt to my wonderful wife, my beautiful children, and my wider family for putting up with me over the years. I'm afraid you'll be seeing a lot more of me from now. You are truly everything to me. And although, of course, as you can tell, I'm sad that my time as First Minister is ending. But I am so grateful, I'm so blessed for having the opportunity that are afforded to so few to lead my country. And who could ask for a better country to lead than Scotland? Thank you very much.
First Minister,
First Minister, can you make a figure miscalculation?
Have you left the party in a worse state than you found it?
What's your biggest regret?
And with those words, Humza Yousaf, the First Minister of Scotland, for I think about 13 months, has quit the field. He's left the room, actually, not taking questions from journalists. We'd been led to believe, in fact, that he would. But there it is. I mean, rare to hear. I suppose when you're on the way out the door, you can take ownership of the situation in a way that you can't do when you're trying to cling on to power. But a full and frank acknowledgement of his own misjudgment there in the cessation of the Butte House Agreement with the Greens that was essentially propping up the SNP's majority in Holyrood. And as he said himself, he completely miscalculated on what the reaction of the Greens would be. So refreshing honesty, albeit that it comes very much as he is on the way out. 28 days then, I think, give or take, to find a new First Minister. And I don't know, we've done a phone-in on it already, so I don't know whether we now respond to this knowing that he was going, if it would be in any way more informative or illuminating than doing it when we were pretty sure he was going. I'll take Scott's call from Clydebank, actually, and then probably we'll reset and do something new after the next break. You were listening to that, Scott. What did you make of it?
To be honest, it's disappointed that it had to happen. I think it was a bit of political naivety on his part with the Butte House, and he was open there and admitted that himself. I think, unfortunately, we're in a situation that we've seen all too often where a bit of the pantomime of politics has pushed a good politician out, and it's sad when we've had so many bad politicians stayed in positions and not fell on their sword, so to speak, as he had today.
I don't think he had any. He didn't have any choice, did he? But it was interesting in that he would have seen it, and obviously probably should have spoken to them before in some way to establish what the reaction of the Greens was likely to be. But he would have seen the 2030 pledges as impossible, and therefore, perhaps as a matter of honour, we're not going to continue pretending that we are committed to something that I know we can't deliver. Whereas the Greens found that an untenable position. They found stepping back from that commitment to be inconceivable.
Yeah, absolutely. The two main reasons that the Greens pulled out was the cash report and the 2030 net zero target. I think he was honest with both. The cash report, there's parts of that do need to be implemented. Our support plans, I think there's a lot of identity politics and quotations that's used for that, but it's often forgotten that the majority of the Scottish Parliament supported it.
Yes.
Almost every single MSP supported it, other than some select Tory MPs. Sure. So it wasn't just an SNP or a Scottish Government thing. But the Greens... It
was more about 2030, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It was honest, though. It's not going to work.
I was impressed by that. I thought that, it was proper patriotism at the end there as well, which is quite nice to hear, isn't it? The true love of country without it having to involve any maligning of others. Scott, thank you. Gina Davidson is, of course, LBC's political editor in Scotland. She was in the room, although not able to ask any questions, Gina. What happens now?
What happens now? We expect the SNP's National Executive Committee to meet with some urgency because they will now have to have a leadership election. James, Humza Yousaf there, his resignation triggering that replacement because he's really resigning as leader of the party. He's going to stay on as First Minister until a new leader is elected. So we will find out when that meeting is due to take place pretty quickly, we think. There's usually about a 2-week period for nominations, and then it would go into election proper. But they had such a bruising time of this last year when Humza Yousaf was elected. I think there appears to be a view that they won't want to go through that again, and we could actually find that somebody might just end up being, there might be a coronation, potentially. John Swinney.
Yeah, and John Swinney would be the obvious candidate for that role, you think?
Yes, that is certainly what's being talked about today, and I think mostly because he's obviously, very experienced, was Deputy First Minister to Nicola Sturgeon for a long time, but works well with people across the chamber, other parties, particularly the Scottish Greens, who of course, all this was triggered by them being kicked out of government. So it could well be the case that they would be quite happy to see him replace Humza Yousaf and could support that, because there will still have to be a vote whenever it happens within the Parliament to appoint somebody as First Minister. And if it's somebody like John Swinney, the Greens would definitely get behind him.
Just remind us why he didn't stand last time.
He didn't stand last time. He was Deputy First Minister to Nicola Sturgeon, and I think at that time they felt that it was time for a whole to clean the slate, really. A whole new generation to come through of younger SNP MSPs. Humza Yousaf and his cabinet has been pretty much packed with them. But I think what is interesting is that nobody is talking about them. I mean, there's been some speculation about Jenny Gilruth, who's the current Education Secretary. Highly unlikely that she would be able to have anybody coalesce around a leadership campaign from her. Kate Forbes is always talked about because she ran the last time. Again, I don't think that she wants to run again. I think she was really rather battered by that experience. And Neil Gray is the current Health Secretary, but he's a very good friend of Humza Yousaf, and he, as a young family too, he just might not think that now is the time for him. Somebody like John Swinney might be able to bring the party back together, because there have been major rifts since Nicola Sturgeon stood down last year.
Gina Davidson, many thanks, live from Edinburgh, where, as you hear, Humza Yousaf has resigned as leader of the SNP and remains First Minister until his replacement is confirmed. I nearly said elected, but Gina there making quite a compelling case for there not being an election process. We shall see whether there's an anointment or a coronation. At which point, of course, Humza Yousaf would cease to be First Minister as well. I quite like this message from James. First bit of honesty I've heard from Electon, James, since Theresa May's resignation speech. And, it's got some mileage, that observation. Time now is 12:17. It is 20 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the resignation of Humza Yousaf as leader of the SNP, and essentially a de facto resignation as First Minister, although he will stay in post until his replacement is concerned, has just unfolded. Some very sad news, for me at least, and anyone else who is an admirer of the author C.J. Sansom. It's been announced that he's died at the age of 71, which is particularly poignant in a way, because the masterpieces that he wrote, the Shardlake series of novels that he wrote, are about to be televised. If I had to pick two writers from the last 10 years who have completely seduced me, I'd probably pick C.J. Sansom and Mick Herron, who also, of course, has seen his series turned into absolutely brilliant television, starring Gary Oldman as Jackson Lamb. But I don't know whether C.J. Sansom, I hope he got to see some early, comes to Disney I think at the beginning of next month, so any day now, so you have to be fairly hopeful that he'd have had the chance at least to see it himself. First season is released on Wednesday, but C.J. Sansom, whose Shardlake series of novels are works of absolute beauty. He's the reason why I am now a huge fan of historical crime fiction. So the other writers that I've subsequently discovered, like Andrew Taylor and S.W. Perry, who used to work here actually many moons ago, all of them I owe my passion for that genre to him, and there are plenty of others in that genre as well, but we've got other stuff to do. 22 after 12 is the time. The assisted dying legislation that is to, or at least assisted dying is to be back in front of the House of Commons. Nick did a very moving interview with Dame Esther Ranson earlier. She has, as you may know, joined Dignitas, the Swiss clinic where assisted dying is practiced. In fact, the number of people doing that, becoming members of Dignitas, has risen by 24%. British membership of Dignitas has risen by 24% in 2023 alone. Scotland is having a vote on the issue next year. Jersey and the Isle of Man are considering legislation, and Sir Keir Starmer, should he become Prime Minister, has promised a free vote on the subject. And I do you know some subjects? I get a bit weird sometimes. Some days I get to work and there's something in the news that makes me go, well, that's got phone in written all over it. And sometimes I then have a second voice in my head which goes, look, remember, this is really serious. Some days I don't remember that. Some days I can dive straight into a phone in because it's a brilliant phone in, even if it is a matter of life and death. And nothing could be more fitting of that description than this particular topic. But for some reason, I was walking back into the studio at 15:15, and for some reason, the voice in my head said, don't just go into another phone in on this, because it's so huge. I guess I'm sort of talking about the idea of forgetting the seriousness of a scenario or of a story, of a conversation, because of the parameters of the medium that we're working in. We're normally pretty good at it, I think. We're normally very good at it. But this one today, I was just about to be glib. I think I was just about to be glib. I think I just caught myself in the nick of time, not being glib, not being like, oh, well, that'll see us through to 1 o'clock. Here's a... Because this is an almost unbearable story. And it is one which has seen extraordinary reversals of opinion undertaken on both a personal and a public and political level. Growing up, and I was raised as a Catholic, and my opinion on many subjects was informed by my Catholicism. I'm sure it still is, but on the ones I've changed my mind about, my Catholicism was a big part. So the idea of anyone but God taking a decision about life like this was troubling for me as a very young person, as a much younger person. And then the conversations that we used to have about doors being opened to abuses of any form of assisted dying. And then encounters that I've had myself, very personal encounters that I've had with terminally ill people or profoundly disabled people who wanted to end their lives, and the arrogance attached to telling them that they can't. I think arrogance is the right word. You might prefer morality, but morality can be quite arrogant sometimes. In fact, often morality is arrogant because it's a prioritization of your own beliefs over the pain and suffering of other people. So I think in my case there was an arrogance attached to my morality on this issue. And then I changed my mind. It didn't happen overnight. I used to think it had done. I used to think that a particularly powerful encounter with a crusading advocate of assisted dying had sort of converted me in a moment. But I caught myself a couple of months later rethinking it and thinking again, are we sure we want to go down this road? And then yesterday, I found myself responding with a sort of moral or mental turmoil to a piece that a journalist called Josh Glancy wrote in the Sunday Times. He points out, I think correctly, that within 5 years it seems likely that assisted dying and indeed euthanasia, which are, quite different things, will be legal in this country. He reminds us that people are ready. Polling last year by Ipsos Mori found 65% of respondents were in favour of legislation. Just 17% were opposed. He describes it, and this brings the religion into the conversation, as a mercy loophole in the Sixth Commandment. Germany, the Netherlands, Canada, New Zealand, Spain have already found a mercy loophole in the Sixth Commandment, that thou shalt not kill. And he writes that he can't help but feel a sense of unease. Have we properly considered the consequences, intended or otherwise, of such a decision? Are we having a serious, fair-minded debate about how far we want this process to go? And his conclusion is that we're not really. And I was really stopped in my tracks by that article, because I was beginning to lean towards the sort of done and dusted school of thought on assisted dying, not least because of the work that Dame Esther Ranson has done in propelling it to the front of the news agenda. And I have taken countless calls from people who've watched loved ones die in unbearable pain, watched loved ones die in unfair and unfeasible circumstances. And I have always found them to be incredibly compelling testimony in favour of assisted dying. But I think that what this columnist is driving at is the unknown unknowns, if you like, to paraphrase Donald Rumsfeld. The deep philosophical or societal question of what changes when state-sanctioned killing becomes commonplace. Just stop and think. Don't think if I had... I've watched one friend die. And it's awful. It's absolutely awful. Incontinence, all manner of indignities heaped upon somebody who was one of the best people I could ever hope to know. So I know what that's like. That argument is close to irresistible, isn't it? But below the surface of society, behind the stories of personal suffering and personal agony, it's quite a big shift in the fabric of a nation to say professionals can now take away the life of someone who doesn't want to be here anymore. And once you start that process, and it will begin with profound disability or terminal illness, I don't really see how you stop it then encompassing a form of assisted suicide for people who can't cope mentally with this world anymore. And that really is what I want to try to talk about. It might not work because we may, of course, understandably and possibly correctly be confined to experience. But if you can step away from this, if you've never contributed to an assisted dying conversation before because the conversation is dominated by people with very particular experiences that have informed their opinion, if you have no particular experiences to inform your opinion, tell me why you are in favour of it or opposed to it. So it's not because of what happened to your mum, God rest her soul. It's not because of what happened to your late partner or whatever it may be. It's a question about our responsibility for each other and the checks and balances we have in place to protect each other and to protect ourselves. When the country becomes a place where you can avail yourself of a state-sanctioned killing, does anything profound in that country change? I don't know. I just want you to tell me whether or not, without reference to a harrowing personal experience, whether or not you have a strong view on this. 034. I think I've forgotten almost why I used to be opposed to it. And that's dangerous. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. You know, how much effort are we going to put into persuading people not to do it? There are two people I always think of at this point, and I'm afraid I only know one of their names, and that name is Henry Fraser, who recently had his life story turned into a wonderful play in the West End of London. But Henry, you may have come across his work a bit. He's a mouth artist. He does extraordinary paintings, just using putting the paintbrush in his mouth. And his condition was almost identical to a lad who went to Dignitas. I just always think of those two experiences. One young man leading an incredible life after suffering this appalling injury, and another utterly unable to face it, and therefore availing himself of the services offered at Dignitas. I'm not adding anything to that, except that both experiences exist in the same space, on the same planet, in the same country. And I just wonder whether there is anything in the idea that making it easier to take your own life or helping people to take their own life may not be the unalloyed good that it is beginning to look like. So nuanced, intelligent conversation, but possibly not as informed as it usually is by harrowing personal experiences. It's 12:32. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 12:36 is the time. Here's the thing. I was about to apologise for using the phrase state-sponsored killing. Just a couple of you unhappy with that phraseology, which and then I thought, actually, isn't that the point I'm trying to make? Because it would be a state-sponsored killing. Assisted dying is state-sponsored killing. And it's because you're uncomfortable with the words that I wonder whether we have perhaps become a little bit too comfortable with the idea. And listen, for the record, I remain in favour of it, but I just have been stopped in my tracks by a newspaper column just suggesting that perhaps we're becoming a little bit glib, a little bit giddy in our support for it and not thinking about some of the other potential ramifications. So that's all. So I'm not going to apologise for using that phrase, but I don't think I'll use it again. How's that? That's a compromise. Colin is in Pocklington, where I once played rugby, would you believe? Colin, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I really do not agree with the statement state-sponsored killing, and I'm glad you've withdrawn it. State-sponsored
You just said it twice. You've just said it twice. I've just said I'm not going to use it anymore. You've come on to complain about it, and now you've said it twice.
You said you weren't going to use it. You didn't say I shouldn't.
Yeah, but you didn't think I should have done.
Well, don't.
I won't. I said I wouldn't.
That's execution, James.
Yes.
That's execution. That's taking someone's life away against their will. I think this issue is one of basic principle, James.
Go on.
Is that my life and your life belong to each of us separately.
Yeah.
My life belongs to me, yours to you, and so does every other individual in the world, let alone the country. It is no one's right and proper to take it from us or to stop us taking it. And in fact, we look to the state to help us. So assisted dying is in the control of the individual concerned with all the safeguards to make sure they're not being taken advantage of. And you don't need really to go any further than that.
Well, you do. You do have to go a bit further. You have to, for example, you have to be reminded that some people have attempted suicide, failed, and never attempted it again.
Yeah, I was a Samaritan for 10 years, so I know exactly what you're saying there, James. And there are a lot of people who talk suicide. We call it suicidal ideation.
Yes.
Who aren't going to go through with it, who are just crying out in the despair of the moment that they're in. And myself and my colleagues, when I was a Samaritan, did our best to help them think things through and to take stock of what they wanted.
Would you support similar treatment and behaviour towards people currently convinced that they want to go down the assisted dying path? Would you essentially think that we should try to talk them out of it?
I think we should help them make their decisions. I don't think it's up to me to persuade you or anybody else to do anything.
But that's part of
you make your right decision for yourself.
And would you have used that description to describe your work as a Samaritan as well?
Yeah, I didn't persuade anybody to do anything when I was a Samaritan. That's against what Samaritans should be doing.
Right.
What we do is we listen and we hold up the card to them so they hear what they're saying. When people talk things out, it's very different from thinking things through. They get more structure, more understanding in their minds just by the process of talking things out with someone neutral.
Yes, it's incredibly important work that you do. And in fact, you'll allow me to remind people that if they're affected by any of these issues, then the number is 116 123. So it's 123. So it is a pretty clear-cut thing for you.
For me, it's completely clear-cut because, as repeating myself now, which you were doing earlier, repeating myself now, it is my life and my body, and I have every right to be able to look to my state and my community and my friends to help me to end when I am in so much pain and so much discomfort.
Yeah. Well, what if you're not, though? What, I mean, the final question, I promise. Would you be as comfortable in this position if it was somebody who'd just had enough? with no
well, it
physical.
depends how old they were. If they were so tired and worn out and they were in their 90s and they couldn't face any more of the effort,
40s.
then I probably would.
40s.
But if they were in their teens or their 20s, then I wouldn't. And I don't think that would, in terms of the safeguards that should be in place, they wouldn't cross the threshold.
No, but we are at least acknowledging the existence of a grey area where a moment ago it did feel black and white. Thank you, Colin, and thank you for the work that you did as a Samaritan as well. I've got a friend who does it, and I know the toll it can sometimes take on the people on the other end of the phone. I can't really get past this from Nate in Paynton, and it makes me wonder whether the idea of trying to exclude the harrowing personal experiences was the right one. I would ring in, James, he says, but I'm a harrowing example rather than a dispassionate observer. That's the word I was looking for, dispassionate. I'm a 43-year-old dad of 2 young boys, and I have stage 4 bowel cancer. I'm staring down the barrel of dying via a blocked bowel, which is absolutely horrific, very, very soon. I would love to make my case for being allowed to die on my own terms. Well, you can if you want, mate, obviously, if you're not going to take you off air. But I can't argue with you. I don't want to argue with you. I could have a bit of a philosophical discussion with Colin, and yet I still haven't fully articulated where I'm coming from because I'm not quite sure. Just the idea that I'm in favour of it, but I think we should be talking about it more, if that makes sense. We should be doing things like wondering what happens to healthy people, physically healthy people who've decided they've had enough. Tristan's in Greenwich. Tristan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I agree with you. I think it's one of those things where if it came in, it would have to be 100% right, because the one time it went wrong, it would fall on its face. The one time somebody was unalived by accident or misdeeds or clerical error or anything like that, the whole system would fall on its face.
I mean, that's sort of true of everything, though, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's a difference between. I mean, I know it's not the same, but look at the Horizon scandal. Imagine that was a dozen people that died because of this. It would ruin the good argument as well. I think this is my suggestion.
Go on.
Let's look at it over a 10-year period, and the reason why it's 10 years is you can do all the legal tests for and against, and also you take the emotion out. 'Cause you're not dealing with people that are suffering now because it's a 10-year process. So it looks at things with checks and balances and free signatures.
That's consigning people to 10 years of avoidable agony, isn't it? Consigning countless
Well, we don't
people.
do it, which we are now. So what I'm saying is let's have a 10-year legal test and checks, and then in 10 years' time put it to a vote or a decision, or a party can stand on it and we can vote on it. But let's have 10 years worth of sort of test and checks before
we could just look at countries where they've done it. Wouldn't that be a quicker way of examining the evidence? Germany, Canada, New Zealand, Spain, and there's loads of countries where it has happened, and they could give us all the sort of guidance that we need on whether or not it is the path to go down. I think we probably all agree that it is inevitable. It certainly feels as if this is the inexorable direction of traffic. But 10 years just feels like a lot to me. That's all. But it fully recognises what I am trying to articulate, which is just a sense that the possible negatives of it are being squeezed out of the conversation. And by negatives, I don't just mean someone who cites the Sixth Commandment, which one texter has told me is a mistranslation anyway of the Hebrew, and it would be "thou shalt not murder" as opposed to "thou shalt not kill." And I guess that the semantics would be that it's not murder if the recipient is willing and wants it to happen. But, these are precisely the sort of hairs that I don't know we shouldn't be splitting. It is 12:47. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Before we get back into the assisted dying conversation, some very interesting developments in The Hague over the course of the weekend and consequently in Israel. And I'm going to take these reports from Israeli media. The Times of Israel reporting overnight that the country is working to block feared ICC, that's International Criminal Court, arrest warrants against the Prime Minister and others. A government source telling the Times of Israel that The Hague, that's the International Criminal Court, is focusing on allegations that Israel deliberately starved Gazans. It prompted the IDF to give a rare press briefing over the weekend to highlight what they consider to be their humanitarian efforts. So it's certainly sort of widespread reporting now in Israel and beyond that this issuing of arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu and others is potentially on the horizon. Reports in America that Joe Biden is working to stop it from happening. And this analysis in Haaretz, which is another Israeli organ, possibly goes a little further. It says Israel scrambles as Netanyahu, Gallant and IDF chief face ICC arrest warrants for war crimes in Gaza, explaining that warrants could be issued this week against Netanyahu, the defense minister Yoav Gallant and the army chief Herzl Halevi, with some legal experts saying that the attorney general and army lawyers are partly to blame for not doing enough to prevent Israeli violations of international law. So towards the end of last week, we reported on that interview with the BBC with Hard Talk by the former president of the International Criminal Court, in which some clarification of what the relationship between plausibility, prosecution and genocide was. It wasn't that the court, of course, had found that the allegation of genocide was plausible. It was more that the court had found it was plausible that Palestinians' right not to be a subject of it was plausible that the Palestinian people's right not to be the subject of genocide may need protection, may need protecting. So this moves that whole story and that whole issue into new space entirely. This would be the ICC essentially issuing arrest warrants for the Prime Minister of Israel, his defense minister, and the head of the IDF. And I leave you to wonder why that's not been more widely reported in the British media this morning. And of course, it may simply be because it's not as big a story as here as it appears to be in Israel. 10 to 1 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Conversation about assisted dying, which is just wondering whether the Sunday Times columnist is onto something when he simply suggests that we're moving towards it a little bit too quickly, that we are heading towards the legalisation without having thought everything through and without having had what he describes as a serious, fair-minded debate about how far we want this process to go. And I think he's got a point. Yannick's in Kingston. Yannick, what would you like to say?
Yes, hello, James. I was educated by Jesuits as a child, although I'm pleased to say I'm a recovering Catholic now. And I remember even at a young age, when we were told that suicide was a mortal sin, I remember being quite alarmed by that and thinking, well, whose life is it? Is it mine? Is it God's? Is it the priest's? I think I would like for anybody in this debate to declare their religious interests before they say anything. You know, whether that's the Lords or MPs, because I think we're a country where Christians now represent a minority, and I think that there are in common with abortion, whatever your views of the matter are, it's not a matter for the state, and it's not a matter for the church, and it's not a matter for MPs. It's down to the individual. And
well, no, because the state, you need legislation to give the individual the right. You otherwise, because at the moment, if you helped me die, you would be liable to prosecution. So it has to involve the state.
Well, but the individual decision doesn't. When we're all free to end our lives. No,
but this is about assisted dying. This isn't. I mean, I understand your conflation, and you're right to remind us that it was illegal to take her own life. Mad though that sounds, as a direct consequence of religious teaching, until relatively recently. But you cannot legalise something without state involvement. And at the moment, the reason why people have to go to Switzerland to do it is because it's not against the law in Switzerland, but it is against the law here. And there's even some nuance on whether or not helping someone get there could constitute a crime in this country. So I just disagree with you about that because of basic facts, not because of anything moral or religious. The state has to be involved in legalising assisted dying.
Well, it does. Well, at a sort of administrative level, it needs to pass the law. But I mean, it needs to be. The other thing I want to say is that I think perhaps our whole notion of death is quite outmoded, based as it is on this kind of religious dogma and everything else. I mean, we often discuss this issue, as so many others, in isolation, as if the world isn't moving on. I mean, as I understand it, in Belgium, they even allowed children to make a decision. Terminally ill children are and have been given the right to make that decision, and that's how far ahead they are. You know, we're still sort of toing and froing, and celebrities are having to get involved in this, that, and the other. And I think the thing, the world's moved on, and the sooner that we take a kind of pragmatic view. I mean, it sounds heartless, but it's just a pragmatic decision. And if we base our notion of death on pragmatic things, yes, and not on religion and this, that, and the other, then I think we can. So much the better, you know.
Yes, no, and I think that's really the point. There's another phrase here that's worth looking at. There's also the distinct danger of a form of Malthusianism creeping in. It's no coincidence that assisted dying is gaining momentum at the very time that we are staring down the barrel of a rapidly aging population and an unaffordable care bill. The obvious risk is that assisted dying becomes a lazy path of least resistance for winnowing down our dependence and balancing the public purse, something that Matthew Parris wrote explicitly in support of in the Times quite recently, to quite a passionate response. But I think that's the point, isn't it? I'll read you this because I mean it raises a valid point, although the accusation being levelled at me by Richard is pretty gross, actually. Every report you just quoted also stated that if arrest warrants were issued to members of the Israeli government, then they would also be issued to various members of Hamas. You can only have failed to accurately mention that because you are, wait for it, a Jew-hating pro-Hamas supporter who is now misrepresenting news as well. Crikey. All I did was read the headlines and then the opening paragraph because they'd been put together as a sort of package on the tweet that came up when I searched for the story. But you're absolutely right, Richard. The Israeli officials who are anonymously briefing journalists that they believe that the International Court is preparing to issue arrest warrants for senior government officials on charges related to the conflict with Hamas also believe that the court is weighing arrest warrants for leaders from Hamas. I suppose that terrorists who've undertaken a massive atrocity being accused of war crimes is dog bites man territory, but a sovereign nation that tells us repeatedly that it is the most moral, the possessor of the most moral army in the world, that being issued with arrest warrants by the International Criminal Court would be more man bites dog territory, Richard. But possibly that is an analysis born of my status as a Jew-hating pro-Hamas supporter dedicated to misrepresenting the news. Have a lovely day. Mark's in Hampstead with the last word on this. Mark, what would you like to say?
Hey, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
First of all, sorry, just can't ignore the previous comments. I happen to be Jewish. I listen to your show. While I often disagree with you, I certainly don't consider you to be a Jew hater by any stretch of the
Hang on, get it
imagination.
right. A Jew-hating pro-Hamas supporter dedicated to misrepresenting the news. I'm grateful for your support in this case, Mark, but I'm going to cautiously suggest it's not really necessary. But thank you nonetheless.
And I will just say this is coming from someone who disagrees with you a lot of the time.
Exactly. Exactly. That's healthy. Back to assisted
James,
dying. Crikey.
Onto lighter topics.
Yes.
Look, when I started listening to the topic raised, I actually do have personal experience with this. I did watch my father die a slow and extremely painful and obviously inevitable death a couple of years ago, where he tried to explore possibilities to assist or speed up or hasten his own death.
Gosh.
I live in the US, but he lives here in the UK, and so it wasn't possible. And when the inevitable happened, it wasn't pretty either. But I know you didn't want personal experiences necessarily tied to this.
I think it was a bit naive of me to expect to be able to separate them, really.
But I will share, that I think that if the UK was the first Western democracy to be exploring this, then the concerns would be, and frankly are justified.
Yeah.
But as I said to your producer before coming on, there is somewhat of a roadmap that can be explored in terms of, the term slippery slope is overused in this context, but it probably makes sense to an extent. And I think that if that concern exists, then it justifiably should. We should look to smart Western democracies who are a little further along in this process than the UK is, and examine how they have dealt with these challenges, and if they have presented themselves as obviously as the concern
and what
is,
they've
then,
put in place.
Let's learn from that.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that's a brilliant last word on the subject as well. Their precedents are there to explore without fear or favour. Mark, thank you. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 But now it's time